They say that history sleeps, a quiet river flowing into the sea of time. But they are lying to you. History is a screaming volcano, and nowhere did the eruption shatter the world more violently than on the sun-baked stones of Greece. Can you believe that an entire civilization, one of the most powerful and technologically advanced the ancient world had ever seen, simply vanished overnight? This is not some quiet bedtime story. This is the chronicle of how gods were born, how empires were built on the backs of titans, and how the entire structure of the known world was reduced to ash and silence. A catastrophe no one saw coming, a collapse so profound we are still haunted by its ghosts 3 millennia later. We begin in the age of legends, the true age of heroes, a time when massive cyclopean walls protected kingdoms so rich in gold and power they defined the very meaning of invincibility. We are talking about Mycenae, the powerhouse of the Bronze Age, the civilization that Homer would later immortalize, the true masters of the Aegean Sea. Imagine cities carved out of mountainsides, defended by stones so massive that later generations, the ones who had forgotten how to build them, believed only giants could have placed them there. These were the palaces of the Wanaks, the warrior kings, men whose armor was bronze, whose chariots thundered across the plains, and whose wealth was measured in tons of precious metals hauled back from conquered shores. Think of Agamemnon, the king of kings, whose palace at Mycenae was not just a home, but the command center for the greatest military operation of its era, the Siege of Troy. This wasn't some minor skirmish. This was a decade-long war of attrition that defined the military might of the Mycenaean world. They had the shipbuilding capacity, the logistical genius, and the sheer manpower to project power hundreds of miles across treacherous waters and bring a seemingly impenetrable fortress city to its knees. The palaces weren't just fortified. They were hubs of complex bureaucracy. We know this not from romantic myths, but from the Linear B tablets, clay records baked hard in the very fires that ultimately consumed them, preserving the mundane details of a hyper-organized society. These tablets tracked everything: sheep counts, bronze inventories, oil rations, and the allocation of hundreds of specialized laborers, from goldsmiths to perfumers, to the women weaving the luxurious woolen textiles that clothed the elite. This was a rigidly structured, highly militarized, but astoundingly interconnected world. The Mycenaeans weren't isolated city-states yet. They were a vast network of cooperating, competing, and often warring kingdoms that shared a language, a writing system, and a deep cultural identity. They traded with the Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians along the Nile, and the Minoans who had preceded them on Crete, forming a fragile, shimmering web of international commerce. But the web was stretched too thin. The sheer complexity required to maintain this level of opulence and military readiness was a ticking clock. Nobody in the sprawling halls of Pylos or the towering citadel of Mycenae saw the fundamental vulnerability beneath their bronze sheen. They were too busy counting their tribute and polishing their swords, convinced their system was eternal.
Then the earth stood still. Around 1200 BCE, the entire Mediterranean ecosystem of empires suffered a simultaneous, crushing blow. The great civilizations of the Near East, the New Kingdom of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, the powers in Ugarit, all began to buckle under pressure. But in Greece, the collapse was total, absolute, and terrifyingly fast. The archaeological evidence is a horror movie captured in stone and ash. Palaces like Mycenae, Tyrians, and Pylos didn't just decline, they were burned to the ground. Pylos, the glorious coastal city, shows no evidence of battle damage before the fire. The attack was so swift and overwhelming that the administrative staff barely had time to finish writing their final, desperate Linear B tablets, records that show frantic preparations for a coming enemy they couldn't name and couldn't stop. The destruction was uniform and brutal. Not just the wealthy palaces, but the smaller surrounding settlements, the infrastructure, the entire framework of the Mycenaean state was annihilated. The complex redistribution system, the centralized agriculture, the specialized labor, it all dissolved into nothingness. The very art of writing, the intricate Linear B script, was instantly forgotten. Literacy vanished from the Greek peninsula for 400 agonizing years. Can you imagine an entire society forgetting how to read? It's a testament to the sheer scale of the societal breakdown. It wasn't just a political defeat. It was a civilizational lobotomy. Suddenly, the vast trade networks dried up. Copper stopped flowing from Cyprus. Tin, essential for making bronze, disappeared entirely. The Mycenaean warriors, the bronze-clad masters of the battlefield, literally ran out of metal to forge their weapons. Historians debate the cause of this seismic event with passionate fury. Was it climate change, triggering widespread drought and famine? Was it internal revolt, the oppressed masses finally rising against the gilded Wanaxes? Or was it the arrival of a mysterious, terrifying, and relentless external enemy? Enter the villains of this first chapter, the enigmatic Sea Peoples. These were not a single unified nation, but a coalition of desperate, migrating raiders whose very existence terrorized the coastal regions of the eastern Mediterranean. Egyptian hieroglyphs describe them in chilling detail. The Sheridan, the Peliset, who would later lend their name to Palestine, and the Checker, marauding hordes moving by land and sea, leaving only scorched earth in their wake. While the Sea Peoples certainly played a role in the broader Mediterranean crisis, in Greece itself, the story is far murkier, far more intimate and devastating. Many scholars now believe the final fatal blow came not just from outsiders, but from internal migrations and conflicts, perhaps fueled by resource scarcity and the desperate movement of groups like the Dorians, pushing south into the shattered heartland of the Mycenaean world. The result was 4 centuries of utter darkness. The vast population that had sustained the Bronze Age cities plummeted. People abandoned the coastlines, fleeing inland to isolated, impoverished hamlets. They stopped building with stone and reverted to mud brick and thatch. The luxuries, the specialized knowledge, the monumental architecture, it all became impossible. The glorious age of heroes ended not with a triumphant battle, but with the whimpering silence of isolated villages trying to survive the unending winter of history. This was the moment the very idea of Greece died, only to be reborn 400 years later as something utterly different. The stage is set for the long, desperate journey through the shadow known only as the Dark Age, the true genesis of the civilization we think we know. The roaring inferno that consumed the citadels of Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos was not the end of the world. It was merely the opening act for something far, far worse: the Great Silence. Imagine a complex, globalized society capable of tracking vast fleets and armies, suddenly stripped bare, its memory erased by a terrifying historical amnesia. The destruction was so complete, the shock wave so paralyzing, that the very mechanism of record-keeping, the intricate bureaucratic script known as Linear B, vanished from the face of the earth. It didn't degrade slowly, it was instantly forgotten, becoming as alien to the survivors as the language of the stars. For 400 years, the people of the Aegean world would live without the fundamental ability to write their own history, unable to pass down anything more complex than a whispered legend or a fragmented song. This was the terrifying reality of the Greek Dark Age, a monumental regression unprecedented in the history of the Mediterranean. The magnificent palaces, centers of wealth and military might, were not rebuilt. They were abandoned to the dust and the elements, becoming the haunting, cyclopean ruins that future generations would mistakenly believe were built by giants, not their own ancestors. The vast trade networks that had brought tin from distant lands to forge the necessary bronze for armor and tools dissolved entirely. Suddenly, bronze became a luxury, a resource reserved only for the most desperate weapons or symbolic ornaments of a dying aristocracy. This scarcity forced a technological downgrade disguised as progress: the crude, hard adoption of iron. Though iron ore was plentiful, the metallurgy was primitive, resulting in weaker tools and weapons than the bronze they replaced. But survival demanded necessity, and the age of iron began not with a triumphant clang, but with a desperate scraping for existence. The intricate hierarchies of the Mycenaean world, the all-powerful wanax, king, the complex court officials, the massive slave populations, all dissolved into isolated, scattered villages. These communities, often no larger than a few extended families, retreated to defensible hilltops or remote valleys, focused entirely on subsistence farming. Communication across regions ceased. The cultural uniformity that had stretched from Crete to mainland Greece fractured into hundreds of tiny, local dialects and customs. The very concept of a unified, interconnected civilization simply broke apart, replaced by a fearful, insular localism, where every stranger was a potential enemy, driven by hunger and desperation. Yet, even in this blackest night, the embers of memory refused to die completely. The stories of the great heroes who fought at Troy, the tales of agonizing journeys and divine conflicts, these were not written down, for the script was gone.
Instead, they were preserved in the fierce, meticulous memory of wandering bards and singers. These storytellers, the living repositories of the past, kept the flame of identity burning through rhythmic, formulaic oral poetry. Every generation, they repeated the deeds of Achilles and Odysseus, unknowingly laying the cultural bedrock for the world's greatest epic poems centuries later. This oral tradition was the only connection between the towering glories of the Bronze Age and the gritty, impoverished reality of the Dark Age villager.
The kingship, as understood in Mycenae, evaporated. What remained were tribal chieftains, local strongmen known as basileis, a title that once meant provincial governor, now elevated by default to the highest authority in their tiny, struggling oikos, household.
Life expectancy plummeted. Infant mortality soared. The complexity of daily life was reduced to its brutal core: food, water, and defense. This was not a period of artistic flowering or philosophical contemplation. It was a 4-century-long battle against oblivion.
But around 950 BCE, a glimmer of light, faint and hesitant, began to break through the impenetrable gloom. Archaeologists detect the first tentative signs of increased contact between these isolated pockets. A few luxury goods start moving again. The population, having been decimated by collapse and famine, finally begins a slow, excruciating climb back from the brink. These small, defensible villages start to grow, expanding their territory and occasionally bumping into their neighbors, sometimes in violence, but increasingly in trade. The basileis found that managing growing populations required more than just brute force. It needed organization, consensus, and shared rules. They began to consolidate power, bringing smaller settlements under their sway, forming the first rudimentary territorial units. This slow, inevitable process, driven by demographic pressure and the need for shared defense, was the genesis of the greatest political innovation of the ancient world, the emergence of the polis, the independent city-state. The stage was now set, not for the return of the mighty palaces, but for the birth of a new political organism, one characterized by citizenship, competition, and eventually, democracy. The terror of the Dark Age was giving way, painfully, to the competitive fervor of the archaic period. But one thing was still missing: the power of the written word. The entire course of Greek history, and indeed Western civilization, was about to hinge on a single, brilliant, and accidental encounter with a people who possessed the secret to simple, flexible script: the Phoenicians. The long, terrifying sleep was about to end. The centuries-long nightmare of the Dark Age was not ended by a conquering army or a prophetic king, but by a simple, mundane interaction between desperate sailors in the scattered ports of Euboea and the unflappable traders of the Phoenician coast. For 400 years, the complex administrative script of the Mycenaeans, Linear B, had been as dead as the heroes it once catalogued. The world had forgotten how to write. Civilization had lost its memory.
But the Phoenicians, masters of the sea and the ledger book, possessed 22 simple, brilliant signs, a flexible, accessible script designed for commerce, not court bureaucracy. The Greeks, those hardy, forgotten people, didn't just borrow this system. They performed an act of linguistic alchemy and revolution.
They saw the consonants and added the one thing the Phoenicians lacked: vowels. They created alpha, beta, gamma, the very sound of history restarting, the moment the Greek mind found its voice again after half a millennium of chilling, illiterate silence.
The return of literacy was an explosive event, and it immediately fueled the creation of the defining characteristic of the subsequent Archaic Age, c. 800 BCE, the polis. Forget the vast, crumbling territorial kingdoms of the past. The polis was small, autonomous, fierce, and utterly unique, demanding an almost religious devotion from its citizens.
These were not just cities, they were citizen states, where identity was defined not by loyalty to a distant monarch, but by direct, proprietary ownership of the laws and the walls themselves. Surrounded by unforgiving mountain ranges and the vast, indifferent sea, these independent pockets of civilization, Corinth, Sparta, Argos, and the fledgling, volatile Athens, began their furious, competitive rise.
And what was the first thing they chose to record once the alphabet was mastered? Not tax rolls, not treaties, but the terrifying, glorious tales that had been whispered around hearth fires for generations, the legends that kept the cultural flame alive during the Dark Age's deepest night.
Suddenly, the swirling vortex of fragmented memory coalesced into two monumental, seismic literary events: the Iliad and the Odyssey. A single, perhaps mythical figure, known as Homer, took the blood-soaked rage of Achilles and the decade-long wandering of Odysseus and hammered them into the absolute foundation of Western thought.
This wasn't merely poetry. This was the Greek Bible, the foundational history, the ultimate educational tool. It gave the Greeks their collective mythology, their terrifyingly human gods, and their code of honor, the arete, the relentless pursuit of excellence that would define their entire culture.
Every Greek citizen who could read was now raised on the same battlefield, taught the same virtues of heroism and fatalistic destiny. The heroes of the past were now the blueprint for the citizens of the future.
But the tiny city-states, despite their sudden intellectual bloom, were rapidly reaching their capacity. The land was meager, the population exploding, and the internal pressure between the land-rich aristocrats and the land-starved peasantry was becoming lethal. The solution was unprecedented: a massive, rapid, and violent explosion of colonization. This was not a unified military venture, but a societal tidal wave. One by one, the poleis dispatched groups, led by a designated founder, oikistes, across the entire known world to find new land, establish new cities, and spread the Hellenic sphere like wildfire. They pushed south into Magna Graecia, southern Italy and Sicily, founding Syracuse and Naples, cities that would soon rival their parent states in wealth and ambition. They pushed north into the Black Sea and west along the edges of the Tyrrhenian Sea.
This sudden geographic spread was the true end of isolation. The Greeks were now confronting the vast might of the Carthaginians, the sophisticated power of the Etruscans, and native populations across thousands of miles.
The sea, once a terrifying barrier, was now the commercial highway connecting a sprawling, fiercely competitive world, driven by bronze, oil, and the constant search for fertile soil. As unimaginable wealth poured into the burgeoning city-states, the old aristocratic power structures, the families who claimed divine descent from forgotten kings, began to crack. The newly rich merchants and the indebted, restless farmers demanded a voice. The tension became a lethal cocktail, and out of this chaotic, revolutionary moment, a new, volatile form of leadership emerged: the tyrant.
Note the irony. Tyrant, in this early archaic sense, was not inherently a cruel despot. It was a strong man who seized power outside constitutional law, often with overwhelming popular support, promising to shatter the stranglehold of the oppressive aristocracy.
Men like Cypselus in Corinth, who ruled with an iron fist but brought spectacular prosperity, and Pisistratus in Athens, who sponsored monumental public works and arts, stepped into the void of weakening tradition. They secured their populist authority by breaking up large estates, redistributing land, and sponsoring festivals like the city Dionysia, uniting the people under a banner of shared civic pride rather than inherited aristocratic privilege. This unstable period of powerful, centralized one-man rule was the absolutely necessary precursor, the violent gestation period for the invention that would forever define Athens and challenge every political structure known to man: the radical, terrifying, exhilarating experiment called democracy. The stage was set, the map was drawn, the cities were hungry, competitive, and suddenly possessed of a terrifying self-awareness. The long sleep was definitively over, and the Greeks were finally, furiously awake, ready to launch themselves toward a golden age that still echoes in the marble halls of history. The dust had finally settled. The 400 years of crushing, silent slumber, the Greek Dark Age, was not just a pause, it was a purification. And when the eyes of Hellas finally snapped open, they did not look backward to the crumbling citadels of Mycenae, but forward, with a terrifying, almost manic energy. They were clean slates, ready to write a destiny that would define the entire course of Western civilization. But first, they needed a pen. They had forgotten Linear B, that clumsy script of the palace bureaucrats. But salvation came, not from within their fractured lands, but sailing across the blue water on the hulls of merchant ships. The Phoenicians arrived, carrying not just cedar and purple dye, but the most dangerous invention known to man, the alphabet. It was a brutal simplification, 24 clean, sharp sounds that anyone, from the shepherd to the senator, could learn in an afternoon. Suddenly, memory was no longer chained to the fragile human voice or the expensive, specialized palace scribe. The gates of literacy were thrown open to every common man who dared to learn. For the first time in history, the people could record their own stories, their own laws, their own furies. The ink was barely dry on this new script when two monumental figures burst forth from the mists, capturing the very soul of this emerging age. They were not kings, but poets, Homer and Hesiod. Homer didn't just write poems. He forged the national identity of the Greeks, laying down the heroic blueprint for every man who aspired to greatness. The Iliad and the Odyssey became the Bible and the Constitution, binding a geographically scattered people together through shared myth and shared aspirations of glory. But while the narrative was centralized, the political reality was splitting apart like an earthquake fault line. The old kingdoms were dead, replaced by a radically new, brutally efficient unit of power, the polis, the city-state. This was the true engine of the archaic age. This was not merely a city, it was an idea, a self-governing furnace of innovation perpetually locked in a tense, often deadly competition with its neighbors. Corinth, Argos, Thebes, and most fatefully, the twin titans of Athens and Sparta began their inexorable ascent, defining the very limits of what human governance could achieve. The explosive population growth, fueled by centuries of peace and agricultural improvement after the darkness, quickly pressed against the limited, stony terrain of the Peloponnese. The land could not hold them, and so, like a supernova, the Greeks burst outward, launching the age of colonization. They did not just send settlers. They projected power across the entire Mediterranean basin with breathtaking speed. They founded cities in southern Italy, dubbed Magna Graecia, Great Greece, and pushed east to the Black Sea, south to Egypt, transforming local villages into thriving, wealthy metropolitan hubs that still echoed with Greek speech. The wealth generated by this oceanic trade flooded back into the homeland, shattering the old aristocratic power structure. The Bronze Age nobility, who claimed divine lineage, suddenly found their wealth dwarfed by merchants and farmers. Who pays for war? The citizen who fights it. And who fought now? Not just the nobles on chariots, but the middle-class farmer who could afford the bronze armor. This economic revolution spurred a military revolution, shifting power dramatically. This new class of heavily armed citizen soldiers, the hoplites, fighting shoulder to shoulder in the terrifying, disciplined wall of the phalanx, suddenly realized their indispensable power. Their spears were not just weapons, they were political leverage, demanding rights in exchange for their ultimate sacrifice. They demanded rights, leading to decades of political upheaval and the rise of the tyrants across the mainland. These tyrants were not always cruel despots. Often they were popular strongmen who seized power by championing the common people against the entrenched nobility, promising order and economic reform. But this instability forced the Greeks into a relentless, high-stakes experiment in governance, seeking the perfect system that would avoid descent back into chaos. They cycled through kingship, aristocracy, oligarchy, and tyranny with frightening speed, each failed experiment sharpening the focus on the next. The result was a profound, ideological schism that still divides political thought today. The absolute militaristic state of Sparta versus the embryonic, radical freedom of Athens. Sparta looked inward, perfecting the art of the perfect soldier, sacrificing everything: family, art, individuality, at the altar of the collective war machine, existing solely to dominate its enslaved neighbors. Athens, driven by the intellectual chaos of its booming port and the radical legal reforms of leaders like Solon and Cleisthenes, looked outward. It championed trade, philosophy, and the terrifying, beautiful concept of demos kratos, the power of the people, where every citizen held a fragment of the ultimate authority. This was the era of the first philosophers, Thales, Anaximander, and Heraclitus, who dared to ask, what if the world wasn't governed by the whims of capricious gods, but by measurable, understandable principles? They were tearing down mythological explanations and replacing them with reason, forging the very core of scientific thought.
The archaic age was the forge where the Greek mind was hammered into its final, brilliant shape. It had rediscovered its voice, defined its political forms, and projected its power across the known world. But as the 6th century BCE drew to a close, this newly awakened civilization had grown so wealthy, so confident, and so aggressively expansive that it had finally caught the attention of an enemy vast enough to snuff out the light completely.
This enemy did not operate in petty city-states or small kingdoms. It was a behemoth that spanned 3 continents, ruled by a single, terrifyingly absolute god-king. The terrifying, unstoppable might of the Persian Empire, masters of all Asia Minor and heirs to Babylon, had fixed its gaze upon the insolent, squabbling Greeks. The stage was set for a conflict that would either solidify the Greek miracle forever, proving that freedom could stand against tyranny, or crush it into unrecognizable dust, condemning the West to an early, silent grave. The world held its breath, waiting for the first wave of Persian fury to break upon the shores of Hellas. That silent grave the Bronze Age had feared, The utter dissolution of Western civilization was averted by a miracle of human defiance so staggering it still echoes in the marble halls of history. The very air over the Aegean Sea was thick with the scent of salt water and impending doom, as the gargantuan Persian fleet, a literal floating city of conquest, approached the desperate, cornered Hellenes. This was not a battle for territory. It was a desperate, final plea for the soul of the West, fought at the narrow choke point of Salamis, where Miltiades had already tasted blood, and Leonidas's 300 had etched their sacrifice into the bedrock of legend. Against overwhelming odds, against the King of Kings, Xerxes himself, watching the unfolding horror from a gilded throne placed high upon the cliffs, the tiny, agile triremes of Athens performed an impossible, desperate dance of war. They moved like deadly, swift wasps around the bloated, lumbering ships of the Achaemenid Empire, shattering masts and splintering hulls in a chaotic ballet of national survival. The roar of crashing timber and the screams of drowning men were the soundtrack to freedom, a sound that confirmed the impossible had happened. The invincible Persian tide had been not just checked, but violently, irrevocably turned back. But victory, glorious and absolute, carried a slow-acting poison in its wake, a venom that would eventually destroy Hellas from the inside out. The immediate foreign threat dissolved, only to be replaced by a far more insidious internal ambition, rooted deeply in the heart of the city that had saved them all. Athens, the architect of the naval triumph, now saw itself not merely as a noble defender of Greece, but as its undisputed master, its political, intellectual, and economic overlord. The Delian League, originally conceived as a mutual defense pact against any future Eastern aggression, rapidly devolved in the hands of the ambitious Athenians into a brutal, extractive empire, funded entirely by the forced tributes of its nervous, subservient allies. Athens spent this immense wealth building a stunning new reality. Pericles stood atop the Acropolis, basking in the golden age of unparalleled art, philosophy, and paradoxical, if paradoxical, democracy. The Parthenon rose, a blindingly white, shimmering monument to human genius and perfect proportion. But every block of marble used in its construction was quarried not just from mountains, but from the rising cold fear and profound resentment boiling in the hearts of the other great Greek power, Sparta. Sparta, the land of iron discipline, silent strength, and unwavering brutal tradition, watched this flamboyant Athenian expansion with deep reptilian suspicion and utter scorn. They viewed the Athenian obsession with words, open debate, and radical democracy as fundamental weakness. They valued the heavy shield and the long spear, the communal mess hall, and the simple, terrifying truth of absolute military dominance. They were the undisputed masters of the land, the stoic leaders of the Peloponnesian League, and they knew, with the chilling certainty of fate, that two such immense gravitational forces could not occupy the same orbit indefinitely without a catastrophic collision. The tension became a physical, electric thing, stretching the fragile political fabric of Hellas until it was ready to tear apart with the sound of thunder. This conflict was no longer about defending against Persia. It was about the fundamental clash of ideologies, the raw desire for ultimate power, and the terrifying realization that the only entity truly capable of destroying Greece was Greece itself.
The war itself was a brutal, agonizing paradox. It was fought between the two most culturally and militarily advanced societies the West had yet produced, resulting in a level of devastation so profound it would eventually make the Mycenaean collapse look like a minor inconvenience. Athens, relying on its unbeatable stone walls and its total access to the sea, transformed its strategy into a slow, suffocating siege, trusting that its naval power could starve out the Peloponnese while staying perfectly safe within its mighty long walls.
With Pericles gone, the Athenian democracy, once the ultimate pride of the Mediterranean world, began to unravel into a terrifying spectacle of populist hysteria, self-serving betrayal, and cynical demagoguery. Figures like the rash and wildly ambitious Alcibiades emerged, a man whose overwhelming charisma was matched only by his staggering self-interest, pushing the city toward increasingly desperate and reckless military ventures. The Sicilian expedition became the ultimate, hubristic gamble, a mad, desperate attempt to conquer an entire island far from home, draining Athenian manpower, resources, and hope like a hemorrhage that could not be stopped. Meanwhile, Sparta, under the steady, calculating hand of its generals, adopted a strategy of grinding, patient attrition, systematically devastating the Attic countryside year after brutal year. Crucially, the Spartans learned from their enemy. They realized they could not win the war without challenging Athens on the waves, and in a move of profound historical irony and pragmatism, they swallowed their ancient pride and accepted massive amounts of gold from their old mortal enemy, Persia. The remnants of the Achaemenid Empire, delighted to see Hellas completely destroying itself, eagerly bankrolled the construction of a massive, modern Spartan fleet. The final, crushing, and humiliating blow came at Aegospotami in 405 BCE. The Spartan admiral Lysander executed a flawless surprise attack, catching the entire remaining Athenian fleet completely undefended and unprepared at their moorings. The destruction was total, instantaneous, and tragically irreversible. Within months, Athens, starved and broken, was forced into submission. The long walls, the massive stone symbol of its defiance, its arrogance, and its independence, were torn down to the sound of flute players celebrating the victory, signaling not only the formal end of a devastating war, but the brutal, catastrophic death of the Athenian Empire. Sparta now stood supreme, the reluctant, militaristic hegemon of a shattered, exhausted Greece. But they were masters of the shield and spear, not masters of nuanced governance. Their rigid, simplistic, and oppressive military system was wholly unsuited for ruling a collection of fractious, sophisticated city-states. The Spartan rule was brief, brutal, short-sighted, and led immediately to widespread resentment and new uprisings. The cycle of internal Greek destruction was far from over, merely shifting shape. The stage was now perfectly set for the next, completely unexpected player to step out of the dark shadows and claim the broken prize. The true center of power was about to shift, drastically and permanently, to a place no one in Athens or Sparta had ever taken seriously: the rugged, oft-mocked, barbarian kingdom of Macedonia. The smug confidence of Athens was their first fatal error, a terminal blindness born of superiority. They sat in their marble halls, debating philosophy and perfecting democracy, utterly oblivious to the storm gathering in the craggy mountains of the north, in the land they derisively called barbarian, Macedonia. Philip was not born a great conqueror. He was forged in the crucible of political necessity and brilliant strategy. As a young man, he had been held hostage in Thebes, one of the premier military states of the era, and he didn't waste a single moment. He didn't just observe their legendary sacred band and their sophisticated tactics. He memorized them, dissected them, and planned how to render them obsolete. When he returned to claim the chaotic Macedonian throne, he brought with him an ambition colder than the Pindus Mountains, and a revolutionary idea that would rewrite the rules of war forever. He looked at the hoplite shield wall, the bedrock of Greek warfare for centuries, and saw not strength, but slowness. His answer was the sarissa, not a mere spear, but a portable, unstoppable siege engine, a terrifying 18-foot lance wielded by men in tightly packed formations known as the Macedonian phalanx. Imagine a spiked hedgehog 16 rows deep, moving with terrifying unity. The first 5 rows projected their deadly points far beyond the shields of any enemy, rendering the traditional Greek hoplite charge utterly futile and ensuring a catastrophic slaughter of the old guard. Philip didn't just rely on iron, however. His true genius was his political poison. He understood that Greek independence was a house built on sand, perpetually weakened by petty jealousies and endless border skirmishes. He mastered the art of silver spears, bribing key politicians in neighboring cities to ensure they stayed neutral, or better yet, became his compliant allies, preparing the ground before his armies even marched. This preemptive bribery was often more effective than an entire legion, rotting the resistance from the inside out. The only man who truly grasped the existential threat was the Athenian orator, Demosthenes. His voice became a raging fire, a desperate, frantic alarm bell ringing across the agora, warning his countrymen that Philip was not just another chieftain seeking tribute, but the absolute, final end of their freedom. He delivered his famous Philippics, speeches so sharp they cut through the complacency like a razor blade, but his urgent warnings were dismissed as paranoia by those who had already been bought or blinded by the vanity of their democratic perfection. While Athens debated whether to send 200 ships or 300, paralyzed by indecision and endless rhetoric, Philip was already securing the rich gold mines of Amphipolis, guaranteeing the endless, bottomless flow of wealth needed to pay his highly professional, year-round army. He was building the ultimate mercenary machine, loyal only to him and perpetually ready for war. A terrifying contrast to the seasonal amateur citizen militias of the polis, who preferred philosophy to combat drills. The final fatal showdown arrived in 338 BCE at the plains of Chaeronea. It was here, in a single brutal afternoon, that the golden era of independent Greek city-states came to a screeching, violent halt. The combined forces of Athens and Thebes, fighting side by side in a desperate last-gasp stand for autonomy, faced the organized, disciplined terror of the Macedonian phalanx and the ruthless efficiency of Philip's companion cavalry. The battle was not close. It was a definitive demonstration of military inevitability, a lesson written in blood and shattered bronze. Philip, the ultimate pragmatist, commanded the main line, but the killing blow came from the left flank, executed with chilling precision by a young, ruthless, fiery 18-year-old prince, whose very name would soon become synonymous with impossible conquest: Alexander. When the dust settled, the flower of Greek freedom lay scattered across the battlefield, crushed beneath the weight of the Sarissa and the unparalleled political genius of Philip. Athens, Sparta, Thebes, all were forced to bend the knee. The League of Corinth was immediately formed, a political body ostensibly dedicated to fighting Persia, but in reality, it was Philip's iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of forced alliance, ensuring every city contributed soldiers and obeyed his decree. The polis were now mere vassals, their destiny no longer decided by democratic debate or Spartan rigor, but by the cold, absolute will of the King of Macedonia. The era of the small, brilliant, fiercely independent city-state was violently over, replaced by the vast, looming shadow of empire and monarchy. Philip had achieved what centuries of internine infighting could not. He had unified Greece, but only by extinguishing its heart and soul. The stage was set not for peace or long-term consolidation, but for the most explosive display of conquest the world had ever witnessed, a conquest that would launch from this newly forged brutal foundation, catapulting the Hellenic world into an entirely new dimension of power and terror. For 400 agonizing years, the world was silent. The terrifying oblivion known as the Greek Dark Ages had stripped humanity not just of palaces and gold, but of the very memory of how to read and write, plunging a once mighty civilization into the prehistoric gloom of illiteracy. Imagine 1,000 kings and queens now reduced to illiterate farmers, scratching out a meager existence under the ruins of their ancestors. But history, unlike memory, cannot be fully extinguished. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, a new light began to flicker around 800 BCE, driven by a simple, deadly necessity: trade. The sea lanes, choked with 4 centuries of fear, began to churn again, bringing with them not just exotic goods, but the ultimate weapon of cultural conquest, the Phoenician alphabet.
This was the moment the game changed forever. Suddenly, complex ideas, laws, poetry, and war plans could be recorded, standardized, and spread like wildfire. A technology infinitely more revolutionary than bronze or iron. The Greeks, masters of adaptation and cultural theft, seized this linear system, added vowels, those crucial breath sounds that gave power to their language, and created the lethal, beautiful script we recognize today.
This single innovation was the defibrillator shock that jolted Hellenic culture back to life, sparking an explosion of thought and structure that history calls the Archaic period, a time when the world was remade not by gods, but by human ambition. The scattered villages, finding strength in numbers against the lingering shadow of the unknown, began to cluster. These were not kingdoms under a central monarch. These were the polis, the city-states, viciously independent political organisms, each believing they were the absolute center of the universe, and holding a death grip on the small patch of land surrounding their acropolis. Picture the agora, not as a peaceful marketplace, but as a pressure cooker of political ambition, where every citizen felt the intense, burning heat of rivalry and responsibility.
This new structure demanded a new kind of soldier. The hoplite, the heavily armored infantryman fighting shoulder to shoulder in the terrifying, organized mass known as the phalanx formation. The phalanx was more than a military tactic. It was a political statement. It meant that the strength of the polis lay not in the isolated, heroic chieftain of the Mycenaean past, but in the collective, disciplined power of the middle class, the farmer or artisan who could afford his bronze shield and spear.
This terrifying efficiency in warfare meant that land became the most precious and most contested commodity imaginable, and the competition for arable soil turned the entire mainland into a grinding machine of low-level conflict. As population boomed, fueled by new stability and agricultural innovations that maximized the use of the harsh Greek terrain, the meager soil simply could not sustain the hungry masses. The land itself was screaming for relief, and the pressure built until the very foundations of the polis threatened to crack under the strain of internal feuding and resource scarcity. The choice was stark, brutal, and terrifying. Internal civil war leading to self-destruction, or radical, world-spanning expansion.
They chose the latter, initiating one of the most spectacular, voluntary waves of colonization the ancient world had ever witnessed. A massive diaspora unlike any before it. Imagine entire families packed onto triremes, sailing into the terrifying unknown corners of the Mediterranean, sent by their mother city, the metropolis, to establish a new, perfect beacon of Hellenic civilization. They didn't seek to conquer established empires. They sought to claim the edges, the overlooked shores, and the strategic trading choke points of the known world.
From the Black Sea's frozen shores, where they founded colonies like Byzantium, the future nexus of 1,000 years of empire, stretching across the rich, fertile lands of southern Italy and Sicily, known to them as Magna Graecia, Great Greece.
They pushed right down to the Libyan coast, the mouth of the Nile, and along the French and Spanish Rivieras. They effectively ringed the Mediterranean like a deadly necklace of fiercely independent trading posts and military outposts, extending Greek influence thousands of miles from the Peloponnese.
Every single colony was a reflection, a mirror of the power and competitive spirit of the mother city, but each one rapidly developed its own savage independence, its own wealth, and its own deadly ambitions. This massive expansion was the moment the Greek world stopped being a localized geopolitical entity and became a dominant global cultural and economic force, controlling vast networks of wealth.
But this sudden influx of trade goods, new ideas, and staggering silver created seismic social rifts back in the homeland. The old aristocratic families, the Eupatridae, held a death grip on political power and ancestral land, refusing to yield. But the new merchant class, flush with trade gold and resentful of their political exclusion, demanded representation and power. The resulting tension was a ticking time bomb, leading directly to the age of the tyrants. These were not necessarily cruel despots in the modern sense. Often they were charismatic, ruthless individuals who seized power illegally, promising land redistribution, debt cancellation, and swift justice for the common man against the entrenched, oppressive elite. Tyrants like Pisistratus in Athens and the iron grip of the military oligarchy in Sparta wrestled for control, creating a political laboratory of unprecedented genius and terror, testing every conceivable form. Two giants were beginning to emerge from the tumultuous expansion, fundamentally opposed in every aspect of life, war, and spirit. The seeds of the ultimate, defining conflict, the clash that would determine the fate of Hellenic civilization and nearly shatter it entirely, were planted deep in the soil of this new, terrifyingly ambitious Greek world.
Get ready, because the stage is set, the lines are drawn, and the inevitable, catastrophic collision between the Spartan machine and the Athenian experiment is about to begin its slow, violent countdown toward war.